Okay, so it looks like some of the people adding into the waiting room is lessening. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for coming today to the Developing the SNAP ENT State Plan webinar. This training was designed for state SNAP ENT staff and is hosted by Mathematica and Social Policy Research Associates. Next slide. So a little housekeeping for today. We want to make sure that people are able to participate in some interactive polls. We'll have a few throughout the presentation, so please respond if you're able to. We are going to have subtitles are going to be on if needed for anybody, and you can access those by clicking on the More button or the three little dots at the bottom, and you can select View Subtitles. And we are going to have some time for questions throughout the session. You can go ahead and put them in chat during the presentation. We ask that you direct them to the questions name. So when you go into chat, you can select questions and send your question there. You can do that throughout the presentation. And we are going to have some Q&A time at the end. Next slide. So again, welcome everybody. My name is Dallas Oberly. I'm going to be one of your facilitators for today. I'm a senior associate at Social Policy Research Associates, and I'm joined by my colleague, Caleb Van Docto, who is also a senior associate at Social Policy Research Associates. Next slide. And our presenters for today, we're going to have Rachel Gregg from the SNAP Office of Employment and Training. She is a senior technical advisor, will be here presenting, as well as two folks from Mathematica. We have Gretchen Rowe, who's the Director of Nutrition Research, and Elizabeth Brown, who's a Senior Researcher at Mathematica. Next slide. So the objectives for today is to really talk about the purpose of the SNAP ENT State Plan, as well as some considerations and tips for the state plan. And again, we're going to have that Q&A time at the end, so feel free to ask questions throughout, and we really want to make sure that we give time back to you to answer some of the questions that you have. Next slide. So we're going to start off by some poll questions just to get a feel for how people are feeling. So we're going to go ahead and launch the first question. We're going to do two right now. We're going to launch this first question. It should be popped up on your screen now, and it's, what is the biggest challenge you face in completing the state plan? So we'll give you just about a minute to answer that, and then we'll share the results.
The poll went away. It went to the results and then went away.
Here, there we go. Thank you. Can you guys see that now?
You're seeing the results.
Okay. So it should be relaunching poll. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. And it looks like we got some responses coming in. We'll give you about 10 more seconds to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share the results of this one. So it looks like we have a large number of folks that it's the understanding the type of information. That's one of the top ones, as well as understanding the questions in the template, obtaining needed information, estimating budgets is large as well. So it looks like there's lots of areas that we have some challenges in. Okay, now let's go back and we'll do the next question. Okay, and you should be seeing that second question. What part of the state plan is most time consuming or complex to complete? Give you just a little bit of time to answer this one, and then we'll share the results. Give you about 10 more seconds. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end this poll and share the results. So it looks like it's kind of spread out across, though it does look like the operating budget workbook is a higher area, as well as summary of the ENT program and component details. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll, and then we are going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And I'm going to pass it over to Rachel to start with the purpose of the state plan. Thanks, Rachel.
Sure. Thank you, Dallas. And thank you, everybody. Looks like we have a bunch of people on the webinar, which is great. I appreciate you all taking the time to participate. So we wanted to do this webinar about the state plan. I'm going to start with the good news. I think you'll all be very happy to hear we are not changing the state plan template this year. It's the same one that you worked on last year. So hopefully that gives you some relief. But we did make some pretty big changes over the last couple of years to the plan. We tried to actually make it easier for you all to use. I'm not sure that you feel like that's what we did, but that was really what we were trying to do. But we also want it to be a more useful tool for you and honestly for us. We want it to be able to better understand your program and what you're doing with your program. But really also what we hope is that when you're working on your state plan, it's a chance for you to really think about what you're doing with your program, what you're trying to do with your program, and if what is happening during the course of the year really aligns with what you say in your state plan. Some of you, at least I hope, have heard us talk about the ENT data lifecycle. I think we're going to talk about it a little bit on today's call. But the way FNS and OET really think about the state plan is it is an opportunity for you to tell us, for you to think about and to tell FNS, here's what we want to do this year. Here's what we expect to do this year. Here's how we want to run our program for the next year. It's also a budget document, so that is important. I saw there were a lot of questions about that. We've done a number of trainings around the budget. Loretta is always available to try and be helpful too. She's on this call, so if we have questions, I'm sure she will do her best to try and be helpful. But it is the budget document as well. So it really serves two purposes: laying out what you're going to do that year, setting the groundwork for how you envision your program operating over the course of the next 12 months during the fiscal year, and establishing that budget framework for us to manage the funding to your state and to your program. For this webinar, we're not going to go through each section by section by section. We did that last year, where we really sort of tried to walk you through the new template and the new handbook in detail. But this webinar, we want to focus on some of the parts of the state plan. We want to go a little bit deeper into some of the parts of the state plan that we think are really important, where it's either that it conveys information that we really need to understand, or it's really something that we want you to think about and try and really use as an opportunity to figure out, well, is our program, when we say we want to do these things, are we designing our program in a way so that it's actually going to be able to achieve those things? We also know that it's clear there's still some confusion. You guys still, I see you're interested in understanding the level of detail, and hopefully we can address some of that as well today. We can do other types of training as we go too. So if you guys, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions now, you can enter them during the course of the webinar. But if there are questions that we see, where a lot of people have them, or we're not able to get to them during this training, we can always try and do more to be helpful. And of course, your regions are always a resource for you as you're working on your state plans. So I think that's probably all I want to start with. Mathematica, I think, is going to take the lead on getting us started. So I will go ahead and I will turn this over. I don't know if it's Gretchen or Elizabeth, but they're gonna take you through some of this conversation to start with. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So building on what Rachel discussed, today we're going to talk about how to approach completing the state plan, and we'll provide some tips for you to consider as you're doing that. Next slide. So, sorry, next slide, actually. So before we jump into the state plan, we want to first share with you sort of where the state plan fits into the SNAP ENT data lifecycle that Rachel mentioned. So for those of you who haven't seen this before, the lifecycle includes the 3 documents that you provide for federal reporting: the state plan, the FNS 583 forms, and the annual report. And these describe what you're planning to do, obviously the state plan, what happened, the 583, and what were the outcomes from what happened, the annual report. And so you can see at the top, that's where we start with the state plan. And that lays out what the program will look like in the upcoming year. And as we'll talk about more today throughout the presentation, is you should be using data from the 583 and the annual report in the prior years to inform your state plan each year. So the plan for the upcoming year identifies the components, the services, estimated participation, and outcomes. And then you'll be reporting on those throughout the year in your 583 and then in your annual report. So the data will indicate if you're on track to meeting your program goals for that year. And then this works sort of as a continuous feedback loop that you're always sort of using these 3 products together. So that's where that fits in. Next slide. So for the state plan, you should be using it to describe the design of your ENT program in detail, and then to discuss how you plan to operationalize that design. So you want to look at the plan as a whole. Each of the sections of the plan build on the last, and they're very interconnected. So although we understand that you're probably needing to break this up and have input from various people to contribute to it, you really want somebody at the end to be reviewing it with an eye to making sure that the information is consistent and that certain sections are not contradicting other sections. So as Rachel mentioned, for today's discussion, instead of talking about each section of the plan in a lot of detail and going through it and pulling it up, what we want to do is highlight how different sections are interconnected and how to approach and think about the plan. So we'll focus on some of the key topics that are essential for the design of your program. First, we want to look at, sort of making sure that you have thoughtful and clear vision for your SNAP ENT program, and then that's going to serve as the framework for the entire plan. And then you want to understand and identify the target population and the needs of the target population, as well as what the labor market looks like. And then you'll use that information to design your components to meet the needs of both participants or potential participants, as well as employers. And then finally, we want to touch on how people learn about ENT and are funneled into the program. And we'll look at some of the information around conducting and screening referrals. I also just want to mention that most of these topics flow through the entire plan. And we'll highlight throughout this discussion kind of some of the logic checks that you should be looking for, best practices, and also just pitfalls to avoid when you're developing your plan. Slide. Okay. So let's start with your mission statement, which, as I said, is really the foundation for the entire plan. All of the other parts of your plan should support the mission statement at the front. So your mission and your vision can be aspirational, and you may not be able to meet it in every individual year, but you just want to make sure that the rest of your plan is supporting that mission and helping you accomplish that over time. And there's nothing that's contradicting it. In particular, you want to check that who the program targets, what partners you're contracting with, what components you offer, and where you focus your budget aligned with your goals for the program. So to make this a little more concrete, just for example, if your vision for the program is to provide services to underrepresented SNAP participants who face barriers to entering workforce programs, but then in your budget, you don't have funds for all participants, or at least a large portion of participants to receive participant reimbursement, then you're probably not going to meet your mission, because a lot of these folks who have barriers are going to need participant reimbursement. Or if your goal is to move people into self-sustaining employment, but in your plan, most people will not be participating in some sort of skill building component, then again, you're probably going to have a challenge meeting your mission, because in order to get these good or better jobs, people need to build their skills to be able to move into that kind of work. So what you want to do is think through, what do we want our program to do? And then in the rest of the plan, does the design work towards meeting those goals? So specifically, when you're designing your mission and vision statement, which is in section E1 of the plan, you want to focus specifically on the mission of the E&T program itself, not necessarily on the broader mission of the agency. And you want the mission to be responsive to participants and employers' needs. It also should include actionable items as much as possible that can be measurable in some way. So if you use kind of more abstract outcomes, it's going to be really hard to define how to measure that and whether you're actually meeting your goals ultimately. And then finally, your mission doesn't need to be set in stone, right? It can and really should evolve over time. So when you're developing your mission and vision each year, you should review your past mission statement, assess if your program in the prior year was meeting your goals, or at least kind of moving you forward to meet them. And also look at the context and environment in which your program is operating. Has anything changed? And if so, maybe you need to adjust your mission statement and or design your program in a little bit different way so that you're meeting your goals. Next slide. Okay, so we have a quick activity for you guys to look at now that we've kind of outlined what a mission statement would look like. So first, we want you to read these 3 example statements, and then a poll is going to pop up. And we want you to select which of these 3 is the clearest mission and vision statement for the SNAP E&T program, A, B, or C. And we'll give everyone a minute to read these and then vote. Dallas, is the poll popping up?
Yeah, let me make sure. Oh, here we go. Here we go.
There we go. Okay. Starting to see results. We'll give people another 10, 15 seconds.
Poll and share results.
Okay, great. So it looks like a few people chose A, most people chose B, and just a couple people chose C. So C is really the mission statement for the agency and not specifically the E&T program. And it actually doesn't have a lot of actionable items that would be easy to measure, kind of like thinking about what a productive life would be, could be kind of difficult to measure. A actually gets us closer, but it's still focused on the agency's mission as opposed to a specific mission for the E&T program itself. Also, it doesn't talk a lot about participants or employers in that mission. So B is really the best option here. It's solely focused on the vision for the E&T program, and it includes specific outcomes for both participants and employers. So those are some of the key things to think about when you're designing your mission statement. Slide. So after you develop your mission, one of the major decisions you have for your program design is who do you plan to target? And some states invite anyone to participate or any adult to participate in their program. Others focus on work registrants or ABODs, and then some target more narrow populations as well. But whatever group you choose, you should make sure that it aligns with your mission and your vision for the program. And then you want to identify what the needs and interests of the target populations are so that you can design programs to meet their needs. So for example, you could offer a variety of vocational training programs, but if your target population is much more interested in finding employment quickly and then building skills while they're employed, a lot of those training programs will go unused. And it may not attract many people to your program just because it's not a good fit necessarily. So you want to make sure that you understand what your participants are interested in so you can better design programs that will engage and meet their needs. Also, you should consider if the program is designed to serve large subpopulations. So if you're targeting all work registrants, but you know that you're also going to be serving a lot of ABODs with your program, then you want to check, but if your program is primarily focused on like job search, then you're not going to be able to cover the time, all the time needed for the ABODs. So you may want to consider adding components in that case. Or in another example, if you anticipate serving a lot of, or a large number of unhoused participants, but none of your providers offer housing support or really understand that population, then maybe you need to think about identifying additional providers who could support that population. Okay, so as you're filling out the state plan, you've probably noticed that there are several sections that include information about the target population. And you should be checking that you are consistently describing your target population throughout the plan. And this figure kind of demonstrates a way to think about the population. So, the main section that is focused on the target population is section E6 of the plan. It's the characteristics of individuals served. And you want to make sure that once you identify your target population in that section, it obviously matches the mission. We'll kind of always be referring back to your mission here. But then there are also, in the component section, in section G, there's a whole piece that talks about the target population for each of your components. And there you need to make sure that each of those components, so the populations that you include for each component, are included within your larger target population in E6, right? So it should be a subset of those. And then finally, there in section I, you also are talking about your target population for your contracts and providers or partners. And you want to make sure that that also aligns. Now, a provider may serve a broader target population for your overall, for their overall program than what you're serving through E&T, but you need to make sure that your population at least falls within that, that target population. So an example would be that if you're targeting ABODs, but a provider's target population is targeting families, then ABODs would not likely be eligible for that program, and it just seems inconsistent with your plan. So you'd want to think about whether that target population is correct and or that's the right provider for your program. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So another core part of designing your program is understanding the labor market landscape. And states must work with their state workforce development boards and or providers in designing their SNAP E&T program. So what does consultation actually mean? It's not just being part of a committee or participating in meetings with broader workforce development network staff where you're all kind of sharing information. It's specifically holding targeted conversations with your state workforce development board, specifically about SNAP E&T. And just to clarify, the Workforce Development Board is different from your state Department of Labor that may be part of your agency or a sister agency within the government. The Workforce Development Board collaborates with local businesses and education and training providers in the community and can provide vital information and data on the labor market in the specific areas where your program is operating. It can also share with you information about occupations that are emerging in the future that you should be thinking about, where there's a high demand for employees within your geographic areas. And they may also be able to identify providers in the community and connect you with them if you have kind of a gap in provision of services. So you can use this information that you learn from these conversations, in addition to what you know about your participants, to then design the components that you want to offer and seek out additional providers if need be. Also, well, you must meet with your state workforce development board and or employers. It's also highly recommended that you would meet with other partners in the workforce network to better kind of align your services with other programs that are out there, or to learn more about the labor market as well. Next slide. Okay. So Section E3 of the state plan documents these consultations. And when you're completing this section of the plan, you want to make sure that you have these meetings in advance so that you're able to document all the information that's needed for this section of the plan. And we want you to be specific here. So some of the information that you should be including is the date that you had these conversations, who you spoke with, a summary of some of the key topics that you discussed, and then importantly, describe how this information helped you design or redesign your program in that year. Next slide. Okay, so we have another activity for you. This time we're going to ask everybody to click on the link in the chat, and it'll take you to the Menti site. Is that coming up? There it is. So click on that, and then there's going to be 2 questions for you, and we want you to write a short response. The first question is about what important or interesting information have you learned from your recent conversations with the Workforce Development Board or others in your workforce network. And we'll give people a minute to think about that, write some results, or write your answers, and then we'll see some of those results, and then we can move to the next question. Do we want to start showing the answer and streaming those?
Yep, Crystal, if you put, there you go.
Okay, great. So I see, oh, emerging professions. I think communication is key is great. Yeah, not having just sort of a one-off meeting too is fantastic if you can set up a communication pathway. Does this scroll on its own or can you scroll? Sorry, I know I think we've had some, there we go. It looks like some people have not been having some of the conversations with other folks that are involved in that. Okay. In-demand jobs, trying to identify sectors, great. Companies with recent layoffs. This is all really interesting. Helping some, so it looks like some people have been helped with the new, identify new providers as well. Great. You want to move to the next question, maybe? You can move on. Okay. So in this next question, then, it's sort of identifying where the gap is. So what other additional information would be helpful for you to learn or to know about from the Workforce Development Board and or other partners in sort of the workforce development system? Again, we'll give everyone a minute or two to write your responses, and we'll start to see some of those come up. So it looks like all of these are looking a little bit or trying to better understand what kind of services are offered and how they can help participants. So learning more about that, leveraging state dollars. Sort of learning more about processes, it looks like, in different ways. Learning more about other providers in the area that can help. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks, guys. So I think it's slowing down a little bit. So why don't we move on to our next section, and we can go back to the PowerPoint. So now Elizabeth is going to talk about best practices for components, which it looks like there was a lot of interest in from the early polls.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. So as Gretchen mentioned, I'm going to talk about the components. And as a reminder, if you have any questions while we're talking, just please enter them in the chat to the questions person. So now you know who you want to serve and what their needs are. You've consulted with your state workforce development board to really understand your labor market, what we just talked through. And so now it's time to put all that information into action. And going back, because we're always going back to that mission that you've developed for your ENT program, decide on the components. So these are the components are really how you operationalize your mission of the ENT program. And the components, as Gretchen mentioned before, should really balance the needs of your participants and the employers in your local labor market. So once you've decided on your components, then you need to select your partners and the partners that can provide the components that you want to offer. So I just wanted to say that again, that the components that you want to offer should really drive the mix of partners or providers that you select to provide the ENT services. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk and really delve into documenting components in the plan. So on this slide, we have some overall considerations for the component section of your state plan. And we're going to go into more detail about the different pieces of the components in the next few slides. So you've got a few slides on the components, which it's great that you guys asked about that in the poll. So the component section of your state plan includes all the components that you plan to offer in the fiscal year. So you should not be offering or reporting components on the 583 that are not included in your state plan. And when describing the components, it's really important to remember that this is not a definition. So you should not be copying the definition from regulations, the toolkit, or guidance as the description of your components. So for example, let's just say that you have a state, and this state has put the following description in their supervised job search. And the description that they include is actually quoted directly from regulation. And they say it's a program that occurs at the state approved location at which activities of participants shall be directly supervised and so on. You know, it's a rather long definition in regulations. So this is the definition. This is a definition. It doesn't describe what components are, what participants are doing or how it's being offered in your state. So really making sure that the description is an actual description. Also, following on from what Gretchen has said, the information that's included in the component section should really be consistent with other sections of the plan. As we've talked about, all these sections sort of have interrelated information, and it's really important to make sure what's here in the components, which is how you're operationalizing all these other pieces of your plan, is consistent with them. Also, we've discussed that the plan is really an opportunity to reassess or reevaluate and look at the design of your program and make sure that it matches that mission. Again, going back to the mission. So it's an important piece of assessing your program is really reviewing the prior year's participation data from the 583 and using it as a starting point to really revisit the components that you offer and that projected participation. So for example, let's say that you've projected in your state plan 1,000 participants in job search training, and you've done this for the last several years. It's what you put in there. But when looking at your 583, you've only served about 100 people in this component. So it'd be really useful to sort of understand why that is, where the need is, and make sure that the plan is more closely aligning with what you think will happen in the upcoming fiscal year. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so on this slide, we have a checklist for things for you to consider when you're completing the components section of your state plan. And we just talked about these overall considerations. And so now we're going to get into the details. We're going to get in the weeds a little bit and talk about the best practices for completing these pieces. And this is again in section G of the state plan. We're also going to talk about some pitfalls that you may have. So first, it's really important to include the information about the component in the correct table. So the state plan template has a table for each of the components that you'll need to report on the FNS 583. So let's just give an example here. Let's say that you have a component that really aims to improve the literacy skills of participants and prepares them to take the GED. This is a basic skills instruction component. You should enter this information in table G6. So all the tables are labeled. It's important that you describe the information in the appropriate table. So we've seen some states that will combine all of their education components and they'll put them in education program other, or they'll maybe combine two together, such as they'll include English language acquisition and basic skills instruction. Now, it's really important that each of the education components and all the components are described and reported separately so that they're in their appropriate table in the state plan and not combined when they shouldn't be. And as I mentioned, next, that description should really include enough information about the services to know what participants will be doing in the component. So let's just give an example here. We're going to use that same basic skills instruction component. And one way that you could describe that is that these are economic instruction to increase participants' math, reading, and writing skills necessary for them to pass a high school equivalency test through a 12-week course. So in this description, we know what participants are going to be doing, how long the program is, and what they're going to be prepared for. So it's that high school equivalency test. Next, thinking about the criteria for participation, the criteria should really be tailored and appropriate for the component, as well as link back to that population that you want to serve. So again, this is an area which is constantly linking back to other portions of the state plan. So for example, the criteria for the basic skills instruction component could be, participants who do not have a high school diploma or equivalent. So we know, based on those criteria, that people that don't have a high school diploma would be appropriate for this component. One issue that we do see is that states will use the same criteria for all of the components that they're offering in that fiscal year, and they're not tailoring the information to the component. So I just wanted to give you an example here of what that could look like. So let's say we have a state and it offers 6 components, and it uses the same criteria for each of those components, and it lists the same criteria in each of the tables for each of the components. Now, the criteria that they're using is that all participants must have a high school diploma or GED to participate. Now, one of the 6 components that they're offering is basic skills instruction, and this just isn't appropriate as criteria for basic skills instruction because the whole purpose of this component is to get someone a high school diploma or a GED. So the criteria really don't match the population that they're trying to serve or have participate in this component. In addition, if a state says it wants to serve justice-involved people or people without housing, but all the components require recent job experience or job history in the criteria aren't matching the population that the state says it wants to serve. So again, this is thinking back to what is that target population, and also what are the criteria. All right, so next I want to talk about the geographic area. And this is another important piece of information, and this information should be included for each component. Now, one way to think about this information is that it really needs to be aligned with how you've described your geographic area elsewhere in your state plan. So for example, in section E1, which is the summary of the ENT program, that first big section, and section E of the state plan, you've described your geographic service area. And let's say that you have described it as select counties. So then the counties that you plan to serve should be listed in the components table. One thing that we've seen is that this is a misalignment, or it's not quite consistent. So in some states, we've seen that in that overall section in E1, they're saying we only serve select counties for ENT, and then when they're describing the geographic area in a component, in the component table, they're listing it as statewide. So this is inconsistent, and there's some questions of, well, where is the ENT program offered in your state? So it's really important to make sure that the different sections of the state plan are in alignment. It's also important that you list the providers for each component, and this is by component. So which providers are going to offer this component? And oftentimes we'll see the same list of providers for each component. And so it's really important to tailor this list and make sure that providers that don't actually offer those services are not included in the provider section of that particular component in the table. All right, next slide, please. Great. So this next item is to really check around those projected annual participation numbers. And in some states, we see projected numbers that are 10 times greater than what the state ends up reporting on the 583. And this is, over multiple years, these projections are really high, but the number of participants is quite low. So it's really important to look back at your data and use realistic numbers based on previous years, unless you're planning to have some sort of significant changes in that component. All right. So next I wanted to talk about the state component reporting measures. And as you know, the state component reporting measures are included actually in section E19, which is called outcome reporting measures of the state plan. But we wanted to talk about it in conjunction with the components because for each component that you are intending to serve 100 or more participants, you need to include a state component reporting measure. And that is the exact same measure that you have in your state plan, which will then be reported on your annual report. And the state component reporting measures are included in table E6. But in terms of the measures, so state component reporting measures should be outcomes, right? And an outcome measure is used to determine the effect, positive or negative, of an intervention or training. And outcome measures should be quantifiable. So the SNAP ENT toolkit actually has a really great section that talks about outcome measures and the state component reporting measures. They give this one example of an outcome measure could be a percentage of ENT participants who received a credential by the end of training. And it's important that you have an outcome measure that is tailored for each specific component. So for example, an outcome measure for supervised job search could be, the percentage of participants that are employed after completion of the component, while an outcome measure for vocational training could be, for example, the percentage of participants that obtained an industry recognized credential. So again, it's making sure that you tailor the outcome, what you would want to see as the effect of participating in that component. So in table E6, you should also include and clearly define which participants are going to be in your numerator and which participants are going to be in your denominator, as well as the timeframes that are being reported. So sometimes we'll see, rather than these outcome measures of employment or credentials, we'll often see process measures. And process measures don't show any sort of effect of participation. Rather, the process measure is like a number of participants. So oftentimes we'll see, the number of participants that completed a component, which is not an outcome, right? That's a process. And so it's important to make sure that you're using outcome measures and tailoring the appropriate outcome measure for your component. Also, these outcome measures should show the effect of participation in the current fiscal year, of participants in that current fiscal year. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Okay, so and I've talked a lot over these last few slides. So now we're going to, we've got a question for you, and I think we are going to drop the Menti link in the chat and have you enter your responses. And the question that we're looking for here is what kinds of tools, resources, or supports would be useful for completing the components section? All right, I'm just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to enter their responses. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of examples with details, examples. Component measures examples. Lots of examples here. It seems to be a pretty common theme. So a lot around reporting measures. Interesting. Oh, this one's interesting. Assistance in how or what we need to gather from providers. We rely on what providers say, but their numbers are high. All right, great. So these keep coming in. Simplify the components, examples. County administered best practices. Okay. All right, well, why don't we go back to the slide deck? These are great responses. Thank you so much for entering them. Keep coming in. All right, great. So you've designed the core of your program. You know what you're going to offer. You know what partners will provide those services. And next, you really need to develop a process for screening and referral of how to move people into the ENT program. And a requirement of eligibility workers is to screen and refer people to the SNAP ENT program. So it's important that people hear about the program and are able to access it, right? Like that's what we want people to hear about it. We want people to access the program. And you really want to make sure that you have a process in place so that you can do that. So when you're completing these sections of the plan, because there are a couple of sections around screening and referral, you want to make sure that the process is clear of how you're referring people to the ENT program. And the role of eligibility workers is not to assign people to a component, but to tell people about the program, screen, and make that referral to ENT. For a state agency, you really want to think about the criteria that eligibility workers are using and make sure that the criteria for your components aligns to ensure that the appropriate people are referred to the ENT program. So for example, if you have eligibility staff and the criteria they're using is they're referring every adult over the age of 18 to the ENT program, you need to ask yourself some questions about that. So do you have services for all those people? Included in that over 18 population could be people with disabilities. Do you have programs that can serve people with disabilities? Also in that over 18 population could be people who are justice involved. So the next, you need to ask yourself, do I have programs in ENT that can serve people who are justice involved? If not, you really should not be referring everyone who's over the age of 18. Your criteria should be more limited and align with the criteria for the ENT program. All right, next slide, please. Thanks. So on this slide, we have more information about what should be included in the state plan in these sections. For the screening section, the information should be clear and have the details on the criteria that the eligibility workers will use. So it should really describe the staff that are involved in the process, talk about how those staff are conducting the screening. For example, does your eligibility system have a series of questions or screens that eligibility workers will work through during the interview to help them determine if that person should be referred to ENT? So what's the sort of process? How does that work? Also, when does the screening occur? All of these things, the description of the timing should be included in your state plan. For the referrals, you need to clearly describe in your state plan how communication happens at multiple levels. So how are referrals being communicated to participants? Like what are people told about how to access the services, the case management they should receive, when they're going to start, what are their next steps for getting connected to the program? All this information is really important, and how that information is communicated to potential participants, information around participant reimbursements, right? So like all of these things need to be included in your descriptions. Next, you should really describe how the information is communicated within your state agency. So for example, does your system have some sort of automatic notification that would pop up when someone's referred to ENT? Or is there a little button on someone's file that says they've been referred to ENT? What is the processes, or what are other things, or how is it shared between state agency staff? And next, you should really also describe how that referral information is shared with providers. So what is the flow of information that's happening from you to your providers to know when someone is being referred to ENT? So all this information should be included and described in your state plan. All right, so I think that's all I had to talk about. I'm actually going to turn it over to Caleb, who's going to kick off our Q&A.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. I appreciate it. And hi, everybody. I'm Caleb Van Docto with SPR, and this is the perfect time for you to drop in questions into the chat. They can go directly to the individual that's in the chat that we named questions. One of my colleagues actually called themselves questions, so that they can go directly to that person, and then it's allowing us to put questions in a sensible order and align them with ones that have come in before, or make sure that we're not like asking questions that have already been answered in a duplicate fashion. So please add those in. And in the meantime, we already have a list that has come in so far. So I'm going to just jump in right off the top. And the first one is when thinking of descriptions and criteria, how does this work when there are multiple providers offering the same component and they may have unique descriptions and criteria for their programs and services?
Do you want FNS to take that, Elizabeth? Okay.
Sure.
Okay, well, we can start. So especially if you have a very large program with a large number of providers, they may all hold slightly different criteria, but I think what we would really like is in some way to understand if you're saying you're offering supervised job search and your providers are sort of all over the map, I do, well, first of all, I would probably have a conversation with your providers, about why the criteria are so different, but, I think what we would really like to see is maybe sort of rolling that up. If there's a whole bunch, you don't have to list it like this provider says this, and this provider says this, and this provider says this. But are there some set of sort of shared criteria for supervised job search? And for me, I would be looking for things like probably, like I would expect for supervised job search, the provider would be like, they should have some recent labor market attachment. They should be able to successfully fill out a job application. They should have some basic interviewing skills. And really just like, what is it going to take to succeed in this program? And I do think some of this is like having these conversations with your providers and really trying to understand what their expectations are for their clients. It may be that they don't have a list of criteria, but when you're talking to them, it's like, it's really trying to understand, well, if we did refer somebody to the ENT program and they wound up after an assessment with you guys, what would you be looking for with that client so that they can succeed in your program? And so it doesn't have to be, I don't think the goal is like provider A, provider B, provider C, provider D, provider E, but really like, well, people who are wind up in this component will need to have these types of characteristics or these types of abilities in order to succeed in this component or activity. So I hope that helps.
Rachel, I'll add one more thing, which is just, and we see this in other parts of the plan, talking about if there is variation, you can provide examples, provide common examples of that variation, and then how, and even really how that might vary, what elements might vary among these various providers offering the same thing. So everything Rachel said, but we recognize it is not meant to be, tell us every little detail about every single part of your program in every county and every, it's meeting the overall state requirements for operating an ENT program and getting a sense of, like, this whole presentation was designed. Do these things align with the target population? Are they meeting the requirements of SNAP ENT? And what types of services are being offered and where? And if it gives us that big picture, you've met that mark.
Great. Thank you both for that. Let me ask one, kind of going back to communication with workforce boards and setting the plan, and that's how do you coordinate? Any suggestions on how to coordinate with workforce boards if they're not responsive or if they expect to receive funding in order to coordinate?
Well, coordinating with the workforce board and doing the consultation for the purposes of this plan, because they're two different things. So are you asking about sorry, dog.
Dog's welcome too. That's part of the answer.
The coordination of service delivery?
I think they're talking about consultation. If the state's not responsive, how do we make sure that we've consulted?
Right. So the state is technically, they are required under WIOA to collect information about employer needs, where growth industries are, what types of services meet the needs of providers, what certificates and credentials providers are looking for, things like that. They're actually required to collect that information and make that information available. So there's sort of a problem if they're not willing to talk to you. I know I'm not suggesting that you figure out why the state workforce board is not talking to you. But I guess what I would say is you can tell us that in your plan. We can try and do some outreach we can try and help you with that consultation. If you've tried a number of times to have that conversation and they're just really, truly non-responsive, we can try and help with that. But I think, as long as you're talking to FNS, to your regional office, to the national office, we can, if there's really truly not willing to talk to you, then something has gone wrong and we can try and help with that. But that has not been my experience. That is that they're not willing to get on the phone with somebody.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. And kind of as a follow-up to that, for states or areas that will standing meetings, like for instance, quarterly meetings satisfy the requirements for consultation with the workforce board?
Well, as with all things ENT, the answer is it depends. But probably not. Usually the standing meetings are to discuss big WIOA topics. It's not typically to give you a chance to ask a question about like, well, we're trying to design our SNAP ENT program. You know, these are who our clients are and this is what they look like. And we'd like to understand what jobs are available to them, who are the right kinds of training providers we could work with. So it really, really should be a conversation where you are trying to collect information about the labor market and job openings and employers and employer needs in a way that you can then bring that information back to help inform the way you think about designing your program. So it really should be an effort to get some like foundational information about if we want our SNAP recipients to be able to get jobs and we're trying to design an ENT program to help them do that. What is the end goal of our ENT program? Who are we trying to train them for? What kinds of jobs? What kinds of certificates and credentials? Where are the training providers who might be able to help us with that? So it is pretty specific and pretty unique. And I suppose it's possible that a standing meeting, that could be a topic of conversation at a standing meeting, but I'm going to guess that's rare.
Got it. Thanks so much, Rachel. I do see, Suzanne, I see that you have a hand up. Are you unable to access the chat in order to drop a question in the chat?
I did have it. That was my question. But I really wanted to have a chance to say, Indiana was told last year that our governor's workforce cabinet, which oversees all workforce related issues in Indiana, was the group that we were to be communicating with, but all they said was, we're fine with your plan. We don't have any comments on it. So we really don't. And in the past, when we've tried to work with our division of workforce development and we've tried to speak with individual workforce development boards, that's basically what we get. We either get, we're fine with it, we don't have any comments on it, or we get, would you like to pay us so that your staff can sit in our office, or, something like that. So we're really not sure where to go to be better prepared for that.
Yeah. Okay. So, and just so everybody understands, it is actually a requirement in the act. They wrote it into the act that you consult with the state workforce board. I know there in the past, we've seen states that consult with local state agencies that consult with their local boards or talk to other organizations. And I don't want to discourage you from doing that, but the problem we have is that does not meet the requirement as outlined in the act. And Suzanne, when you say they tell you like they don't have any comments on your plan, yeah, they probably don't. And we're not really looking for them to comment on your plan. I think we actually would like you to talk to them before you start writing the plan to get some of that information. So for example, to try and find out, they're supposed to be tracking high growth and in-demand industries. And so if you have all your training providers are training people for retail work, but if you talk to the board and they say, well, most of the growth in our state is in healthcare industries, then we would like to see that figured back into how you're designing your plan. And if you're not getting a good response from your board, maybe we can have a conversation, or your regional office can have a conversation with you about some questions you could take, some specific concrete questions you could take, a list that you could email or get on the phone with and have a conversation about. And maybe that would get you better kinds of answers. Because if they're saying, well, if you want to pay us to sit in our office, they're answering the wrong questions.
Well, that's what the workforce development boards say when we communicate with them. But obviously the governor's workforce board, I'm not sure that they're into it as deep as that. That would be more our Department of Workforce Development. But last year we were told that the governor's workforce board was who we needed to have communication with on our plan.
It's because it's what the law requires. So it is. And maybe if they're really genuinely not giving you good answers, you could say, well, we talked to them, and you could write down, we made a call and we talked to these people on this date and we didn't get good information from them. So we also talked to these people.
Okay. I mean, that's what we did last year, but I just assumed that it'll come up again this year.
It probably will, because it is, like I said, it is required by the act.
And just to reiterate, so the act also does give flexibility if it doesn't work to work with the State Workforce Development Board. The act does provide an option for states to consult with employers or local employers or associations of employers to get similar information. So there is, we don't see that very commonly, but if it is an option in your state, if that's not a productive thing, or if it doesn't seem to be getting you the information you need, there are alternatives to meet that requirement.
Let me turn to a little bit more of a logistical question, which is that a couple of folks have commented that a number of states don't really operate as states, but operate more in kind of like a regional model or even a local model. And so do you have guidance or recommendations on how to fill out plans that reflect that regional or local consultation or describe details or components when there's many providers, excuse me, I lost my line. But when there's many providers offering activities that fit within a component, they vary slightly. We talked about that, but like within the context of a regional or a local realm rather than as a state level.
Well, it is a state plan, so it does really need to reflect the state's SNAP ENT program. I know that's not a super satisfactory answer, and I will admit we have struggled for a long time with how to accommodate county administered programs because you can have just such a wide variety of things going on. I know some of you have county plans that then get rolled up into your state plan. And again, I think it's probably similar to like if you have a lot of providers doing in your component section, trying to figure out a way to sum up. It's not, again, I don't think we have the expectation that you will tell us every provider in every county or everything that's happening in every county. But maybe, thematically or in some other way, try and help us understand, the state's vision for the program, what the state's expectations are for the counties, how you're working with your counties, what you tell your counties,
Yeah, is there like a level of detail to specify at the county level that folks should speak to if that's the situation?
I don't know if I don't.
Right, there isn't a requirement in the act that specifies, for example, a level of detail. County administered states really are not addressed in the act or regulations, and so in terms, it just becomes a best practice. It becomes a judgment call, which is what Rachel's speaking to. States should have minimum standards that would be common across all provider, or all counties or all providers or all types of components, and that's really what we're looking for. Again, with examples. We want to get a sense that in a state, a SNAP ENT participant would experience, this level of service or expect this type of service in this program. And I would say our answer might differ. We've talked differently about, there's the component tables and then there's participant reimbursements. I think for participant reimbursements, we do expect maybe a little bit higher, would have a little bit of a higher bar there because that is a client protection. So while again, we understand that those participant reimbursements may vary by provider or vary by county, the state it is the state's responsibility to provide those. And so we want to make sure that all participants are provided, that you're clearly articulating what all participants should expect to receive, and that variation. So I do think maybe all the things that we've said are true, except there maybe is a little bit higher bar for those participant reimbursements.
Probably also for states operating mandatory programs, we're going to need more information as well. So again, it sort of depends. But I want to echo a point Marcy just made. Some of these things are the state's responsibility. And when we're reading the state plan, we are trying to understand, well, what is it how it can still be that the county is administering the program, but that you have provided appropriate guidance to the counties and how to administer that state program. That also helps us understand what you're doing.
Great. We have a list of questions. I want to keep an eye on time too, so we might have time for a couple of more. I want to turn to a couple of funding questions that came in. One is asking about if there's any change of parameters that are coming or will states still receive 100% of their funds in their state plan? And I'm not sure that I completely understand how that question is phrased. But
Yeah, I'm
we're-
gonna get
that-
Loretta on, but I don't think we're doing anything with the 100% funds.
No, no, I don't, yeah, I'm not exactly sure what, what they mean. With regard to 100% funds, there's no change at this point in time.
Yeah.
Just by
And
formula,
nothing
right?
contemplated, so.
Is there any discussion or can you discuss anything about the contracts or partnerships tabs and how operating a budget in the state plan or operating the budget in the attachment, how are items keyed and how do they calculate for the overall budget? Or is there a separate instructions guide?
Well, so I would say that there is on our FNS website for the state plan handbook, there is a instructions document specifically for the operating budget workbook. And it goes over each tab of those operating each tab that's in the operating budget workbook. But basically, you know, the information that's in the contract and partnership tab A, all that information as far as the cost of the cost that's indicated for each individual contract that is distributed to 100% funds or 50-50 funds, that helps inform the contractual line item that's in the operating budget on tab B. So all of that information is calculated and flows into the contractual line item. So, but again, I really encourage everybody to take a look at the instructions document. It's a PDF document. We went through every tab. We provided examples of every tab in that document. So I encourage you to take a look at that. And if you still have questions, reach out to your region and they can reach out to national office and we can get on the phone with you if you're having issues with it. So
Loretta, you did didn't you do a training on the budget workbook before?
we did last year, but I don't, yeah.
Did we record it?
Yes, I think we did.
We can look.
We can find that webinar and send that out as well.
Yeah, we can look. I think you've done a number of trainings, so.
I'm taking a look at time. There's still a couple of questions. And so I think what might be a sensible thing to do would be to document the remaining questions that have come in, and we might be able to include them with the follow-up materials that will be coming in about a week. We're recording this, of course, I think, as everybody knows. And so once the recording is finished, and we'll edit it to cut out the dead times, the beginning of the end, we'll make this recording and the slides available for everyone after the fact. And so any questions that we didn't get to, we'll take a look and see if we can add those with the collection of materials that come out.
Caleb, can I add one thing to that last question, just as something as an observation?
Yes.
So when we sent out the registration for this webinar, one of the questions we asked is like, what would you like to know? And I think a lot of the responses were how to smooth out that approval process, how to reduce that back and forth with the region, with the regional office who's approving the plan. And I think this speaks to Loretta's comment about the budget tool. One of the ways to do that is to use these tools. We understand that, you know, states have choices about their templates. This is the template that we've provided, and the budget tool is, I think, an excellent tool that pre-populates your state's allocations, and especially the swivel tool if states are doing subsidized work-based learning. To use those tools really helps us better understand how you're being responsive to the questions that we've asked, and it can really smooth that process. So I think, you know, that was not asked specifically here, but I know it was a hot topic when folks are registering. So I just wanted to point that out.
Super grateful, Marcy. Thank you so much for adding that. And with that, let me pass it back to Dallas to take us to the end. Thanks so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending today. Again, Caleb mentioned we'll be sending out materials in the near future. And then just want to remind everybody, we will have this little feedback pop-up that when you close out, that you'll see. If you could just respond, give us some feedback from today, that'll help us as we develop future trainings for you. And thank you again for attending.